The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nuclear attacks near the end of World War II against the Empire of Japan by the United States at the executive order of the US President Harry S. Truman on August 6th and 9th, 1945. After 6 months of intensive firebombing of 67 Japanese cities, followed by an ultimatum which was ignored by the Shah regime, the nuclear weapon Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, followed by the detonation of the Fat Man nuclear bomb over Nagasaki. These are to date the only attacks with nuclear weapons in the history of warfare. The arguments to justify the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki focus on how fanatically the Japanese soldiers fought, as well as the atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Army and the Japanese government's refusal to commit to the unconditional surrender demanded by America and her allies. The arguments thereby conclude that the decision to use nuclear bombs saved many hundreds of thousands of lives, if not more. The arguments against the bombing of Japan say that the Japanese had lost the war and only needed to be starved out of the war. Operation Starvation was already in place, and Japan could neither import nor export materials for her war effort. They also state that we entered a nuclear age and introduced weapons that could destroy humanity like never before. The situation upon which the decision was made was complicated. Because of the complexity of the situation, one is obliged to consider the details before concluding if President Truman should or should not have used nuclear weapons. You need to try and understand what was happening politically inside Japan at the time and what her military options were, as well as the culture and conditioning of the Japanese people as a race. For example, the suicide bombings of the Middle East pale into complete insignificance when compared to the willingness of the Japanese people as a nation to die fighting or suicide for their emperor. This is a very important point. This reality can be identified not only in the kamikaze attacks on American warships, but also in an article in the Japanese War Journal of the Imperial Headquarters, which, when faced with the prospect of invasion of the island of Kyushu, concluded, "We can no longer direct the war with any hope of success. The only course left is for Japan's 100 million people to sacrifice their lives by charging the enemy to make them lose the will to fight." The culture and conditioning of the Japanese people at the time did not consider this thinking radical or unacceptable. On the contrary, they considered it honourable and right. This also is a significant point because the Japanese government and military wanted to make the cost of conquering Japan too high for the Allies to accept. We also need to understand what was happening inside the United States politically, as well as the thinking and priorities of the government and their military options. The Americans were suffering high casualties too, and this influenced the thinking of the governments of both countries. One could also safely say that the United States did not want the Soviet Union increasing its sphere of influence into Japanese territories. Reasons for this would have been the Soviet Union's late entry into the war against Japan, plus the fact that it would have been foreseeable that the USSR and the US were future enemies. A quick end to the war was to America's benefit. The atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Army upon the peoples of the nations that they invaded or attacked are written in various languages. I am sure that history books in China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Myanmar and Korea, as well as Europe and not just the United States and Australia, all tell the story of incredible cruelty and horror. It is only in Japan that history books differ in their versions of the war. I will not go into the historical estimates of how many millions of people died. You can read about that yourself. However, on the basis of those historical estimates, I will express the extremely strong opinion that an Asian Holocaust was inflicted by the Imperial Japanese Army. Too many millions of people died. Too much cruelty was inflicted for me not to come to that conclusion. If 6 million Jews dying in Europe is a Holocaust, then 6 million people dying in Asia is a Holocaust too. If you had been in the hearts of every victim, been aware of their pain and the crimes committed against them, perhaps you would come to the same conclusion as well. From the Japanese government's point of view, there were 4 conditions that they wanted for surrender. The first one, they keep some of the empire that they still had. From the point of view of the people living under Japanese rule, that would have been a fatal decision if the Americans had accepted it. I would not have wanted to have been a person in one of those countries still under Japanese control. The second condition was that there be no Allied occupation of Japan to oversee a disarmament and a transition of power by where the Japanese people elected their own government. Agreeing to this condition may not only have led to the rearmament of Japan, but also with nuclear weapons. I don't know if the Japanese government or the people at the time would have had any moral conflict regarding the usage of such weapons. I personally doubt it. The third condition was that Japan conduct their own war crimes trial. I will let you make your own conclusion as to how thorough they would have been. The fourth and final condition was that the emperor remain on the throne. This actually happened and possibly contributed to him never being charged with war crimes. These four conditions were never presented to the Americans. I have mentioned them only to point out how far removed the Japanese government was from unconditional surrender. If you had been President Truman, and if these conditions had been presented to you, would you have accepted them? If I had been President Truman, and if they had been presented to me, I would have said no. Another option, an invasion of Japan. An invasion of mainland Japan would have inflicted a heavy loss of life for the Japanese people who were going to join the resistance and fight alongside the army, plus the loss of life for the Japanese soldiers who fought to the death like kamikaze samurai warriors, as well as the loss of life of the American soldiers and other Allied forces with them. Japan's defences on the island of Kyushu at the start of August 1945 consisted of 65 divisions. They had enough equipment for 40 divisions and enough ammunition for 30. A division consists of 10 to 15,000 soldiers depending upon the country. They also had 3,000 kamikaze pilots with planes to attack the supply ships carrying troops and supplies for when they landed on the beach. They had also established the Patriotic Citizens Fight Corps, which consisted of all healthy men aged between 15 to 60 and all healthy women aged from 17 to 40. Generally speaking, they were poorly equipped, but were willing to fight alongside the soldiers. More people would have died than those who were instantly annihilated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. Would an invasion have been acceptable to you if you had been President Truman? My answer is no, and it is here upon this potential battlefield on the island of Kyushu that the Japanese government and Emperor Hirohito hoped that the Americans would be forced to accept Japan's condition for surrender. Now, you, as President Truman, have 2 nuclear bombs which you know will work because one has already been tested. You have also been told that by the 17th or 18th of August, a 3rd atomic bomb will be ready, and in September you will have another 3 nuclear bombs, and in October yet another 3. It seems like the United States was capable of building a nuclear bomb every 10 days on average. The Americans were not limited to 2 nuclear bombs. For me, this is a decisive point. As President, you have also been petitioned by some of the scientists who built the nuclear bomb to do 3 things. 1. Give the Japanese adequate description and demonstration of the new weapon. 2. Give a convincing warning that a continued refusal to surrender would be followed by use of the weapon. 3. Provide the Japanese the opportunity to surrender on terms ensuring them the possibility of peaceful development in the future. Having explained that, I ask you, as President Truman, would you have dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? My answer is no. To help install some degree of morality to the use of nuclear bombs, I, as President Truman, would have invited the highest-ranking Japanese officials to America and filmed them witnessing the explosion of my 2nd nuclear bomb. I would have then said that the lives of the Japanese people were now in their hands. I would have given them 72 hours to phone me and surrender unconditionally. Showing the Japanese this would not have enabled them to win the war. They were between a sword and a wall. They were defeated. If what I suggest had happened, you demonstrate the bomb, and if the Japanese had still refused to surrender, and then if the bomb had been dropped, there would still be people who would say that it was the wrong thing to do. This is where I beg to differ. No more reasoning could have been done, and at least the Japanese people and succeeding generations could say that our government knew that the Americans had nuclear weapons. I would also